Hello and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Dr. Bret Scher is a board-certified cardiologist and lipidologist practicing in San Diego and also offering virtual appointments in several states. He has also obtained specialized certifications in functional medicine, nutrition, personal training, and behavior modification. He started his own preventative wellness center when he was introduced to the low-carb way of eating after seeing how effective it was with himself and his patients. He wrote the book, Your Best Health Ever, and also has a blog on his website, Low-Carb Cardiologist.com. He hosted a podcast by that same name until 2018, when he began hosting a podcast for DietDoctor.com, where he is now the medical director. DietDoctor.com is by far my favorite place to find incredible resources, fantastic meal plans, articles, videos, movies, I mean, you name it. The latest research you can find all in one place. I can't say enough about how amazing the Diet Doctor website is. Dr. Bret Scher, welcome to Boundless Body Radio.
Thanks so much for having me, Casey. It's a pleasure to be here today.
It's an absolute pleasure to host you, but this is going to get a little awkward. I have a confession to make, and that is that I don't have any questions for you. I sent some questions over yesterday to you so you kind of know what was coming, but I decided before the show that I would go and grab what I needed to make our St. Patrick's Day meal tomorrow. So I ran into the store, this true story, just like an hour ago, and I was, going to the normal places where I go, where they keep like meat and eggs and things like that, and I didn't learn anything. I learned nothing about nutrition or heart health. And I was really excited to talk to you, so I decided to branch out and kind of go where I don't normally go, which is kind of the middle part of the store. And oh my gosh, Dr. Scher, I don't have anything to talk to you. I learned everything I needed to know about heart health. It's right there on all the packages.
Right in the cereal aisle, right? You see
yeah.
the heart label on the Honey Nut Cheerios and the Cocoa Puffs, and you're good to go, right?
Oh yeah, there was variety. I could choose all kinds of really sweet tasting cereals. It was great. And so again, I apologize, but I don't have any questions for you.
Well, I hope your listeners are good with sarcasm, but you're absolutely right. I mean, what we define as heart healthy is so backwards, and this is a whole rabbit hole in itself to go into, but the influence of industry, where the money comes from for, big organizations in terms of what they label as heart healthy, it's pretty nauseating. Both of you eat it and just by looking at it and understanding it. But, it just has been so wrapped up in this low fat mantra that anything is low fat is by definition heart healthy. And you could say, oh, that's too simplistic. That's not true. Nobody ever said that. But yes, they actually said that by their labeling. Any food product that was low enough in fat could get the heart healthy label, regardless of how much sugar was in it, regardless of the total number of calories that were in it. It's heart healthy if it's low fat. And I mean, if that doesn't tell you how short-sighted and backwards a lot of our medical teaching is when it comes to nutrition, then nothing will. I mean, that just highlights it as much as it possibly can.
Wow. And I would say like we're moving the ball forward. People are learning about this and we're getting the message out, which is great. But when did you start to discover that kind of quagmire mess? And how do you think about like other cardiologists who haven't quite seen this yet? How are they going to find out about this information?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I mean, the easy answer is my personal experience. I did a preventive cardiology fellowship, and it was an Ornish style program. So I was definitely taught the low fat message, and then got out into practice, and I was fired up and ready to stamp out heart disease and just prevent heart disease and really impact my patients in ways that they've never been impacted before. And it didn't take long for me to realize that just wasn't happening. The interventions that I was trying to do from a lifestyle standpoint, one, people hated and weren't sticking with. And, you can only write patient was non-compliant with lifestyle recommendations or patient did not respond to lifestyle recommendations. You can only write that in a chart so many times before you have to stop and say, maybe it's my recommendations. Maybe it's not the people's fault that this is happening over and over again. But that's unfortunately a disconnect that a lot of doctors don't see because we're taught so strongly, so fervently, and so almost uniformly that this is the right message, the eat less, move more, count your calories, low fat, that is the right message that, we don't question it because we're taught it so strongly. So I was lucky enough to see that. First, I saw that it wasn't working. And my first response was, well, I just need more time with my patients. So that's when I started this wellness center with a good friend of mine who is an amazing health coach. And as luck would have it, he was very knowledgeable in ketogenic diets and low carb nutrition. And so for a couple of our really tricky clients, he said, hey, why don't we put this guy on a ketogenic diet? What do you think? And so, of course, my first response was, what are you, crazy? I don't want to kill the guy. I'm a cardiologist. Why would I tell him to eat all that fat? And fortunately, he just said, well, have you looked into it? Maybe you should consider researching a little bit, which is exactly what I did. And once I saw that there was actually research, like actual scientific research, and yeah, there were books about it, which were phenomenal books like Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz, but the actual research that existed is what really opened my mind and blew my mind. And I thought, wow, this really is an untapped world in the medical world that we haven't been taught about. And so then I tried it, personally, I tried it and started trying it with patients. And so my eyes were opened. So that was sort of the easy part. Now, the harder part of your question is, how do we get this to more doctors? And we're definitely seeing it. Look, there's a huge groundswell that people are realizing that the low fat message is not the best message. That a low carb diet works very well in a number of people. And, we can't get in the same trap and say low carb or keto diets are right for everybody and the one diet for everybody, because it's the same trap we fell into with the low fat diet is the best diet for everybody. We can't say it's just one diet, but we absolutely have to be promoting it as an option. So as doctors are having personal experience with it, they're starting to learn. As doctors' patients are coming to them and saying, hey, here's what I did, and look at all these amazing health benefits and weight benefits I got, doctors are starting to learn. And that's a big part of my role at dietdoctor.com is not just to make sure the content is medically accurate, so when individuals read it, they know they're getting the most reliable content, but also so when clinicians come across our material, whether it's doctors or nurse practitioners or nutritionists or personal trainers or whoever who can help educate, hundreds, if not thousands of people that they see, showing them what the science says, what the practical implications are, and what the potentials for success are by reframing how you see heart health, how you see healthy nutrition in general. So, the message is getting out there. Of course, I wish it was spreading a lot faster. And that's a big part of my job and my mission is to make sure that message spreads faster than it is now.
Well, that is such an important message. I really love that answer. So I want to know, what were some of the main problems you see as a cardiologist? Like, what were some of the common things? Because I think most people just think cardiologist, they think heart attack, but they don't know the different types or other things that you deal with.
Well, it's a great question in terms of what I thought a cardiologist deals with and what a cardiologist really should deal with. So, the bread and butter, so to speak, of cardiologists is heart attacks, is coronary disease, is doing angiograms, cardiac catheterizations, where you look for blockages and put stents in to open those blockages. It's, treating blood pressure and treating cholesterol, mostly with medications, is what cardiologists do. And then, but there's a whole other realm of, arrhythmias, atrial fibrillation, supraventricular tachycardia, and then problems with the heart not pumping well, congestive heart failure. There's a whole spectrum of heart diseases that cardiologists deal with, but the overwhelming majority of the time, it's coronary artery disease. Now, the problem is that cardiologists are taught, and most cardiologists think that coronary artery disease is a sort of local problem. You have a narrowing in your artery. We can open that narrowing and boom, problem solved. Well, no, that's actually not how it works, because that's not the only blood vessel in your body. Every blood vessel in your body is being subjected to the environment that caused that plaque buildup. So you are going to have some version of vascular disease pretty much everywhere if you have it somewhere. So it is a systemic problem, not a local problem. The second part of the problem of how cardiology generally treats things is that LDL is king. If you've got any vascular disease, the number one thing you have to do is drive your LDL down low. And while LDL may be involved and likely is involved for a number of people, the bigger part of the puzzle is people's metabolic health, their blood sugar, their insulin, their obesity, their triglycerides, their inflammation, their blood pressure, their waist circumference. All of those factors likely have a larger contributing impact than LDL on people's cardiovascular disease, but that's not traditional teaching in cardiology. In fact, there was just a recent article that came out. I think it was in JAMA Cardiology, if I remember correctly. But it was looking back at the Women's Health Initiative study and looking to see what are the biggest predictors for women developing heart disease in the future. And LDL had a hazard ratio of about 1.7, which is a weak correlation, but a correlation. But then you look at a measurement of insulin resistance, and it was 6. So 6 versus 1.6 clearly shows you that is a stronger predictor. And type 2 diabetes had a prediction of 10.
Wow.
So, if you're putting all your eggs in the LDL basket, you can see I love food analogies.
So do we.
My only attempt at humor. It's about as funny as I
we love it.
Which is, so it's not very funny, but it's my attempt. So if you're putting all your eggs in the LDL basket, you're really, really missing the boat on what's affecting that patient the most, which is their metabolic health. And that's something that's not taught in general cardiology. Even in my preventive cardiology fellowship, it wasn't really emphasized. So, now there's this concept of a, endocrine cardiologist or a metabolic cardiologist. And I think every doctor needs to be a metabolic doctor focusing on metabolic health. And that it definitely applies to cardiologists as well. And, one of the really fascinating things that's going on right now with medications is medications that are used for type 2 diabetes. They're labeled as diabetes medications are having profound beneficial effects. Now, profound in terms of medication, which means, like a 2 to 3% benefit, but significant benefits for people with heart disease, even if they don't have diabetes. So you could say, well, that's strange. How could a diabetes medication show benefit for people with heart disease? Well, it's because it's addressing this problem of the metabolic disease. And they're only diabetes medications that don't raise insulin. So the SGLT2 inhibitors, the GLP-1 agonists, these sort of newer medications that don't raise insulin. So they're addressing metabolic disease without raising insulin. Well, so of course, my approach is, well, what else does that? Nutrition, low carb nutrition, healthy, high, moderate to high protein, low carb nutrition with exercising and prioritizing your sleep and prioritizing, chronic stress management. All those things are going to have similar, if not better effects in the same regards from my standpoint. So it is hopefully marking a shift where cardiologists will no longer be solely focused and myopic with the LDL and instead consider themselves metabolic cardiologists or metabolic physicians.
Interesting. Yeah, I just think that original story that was told was, we just got it wrong. Like we chased the wrong thing. There's a video. It's hilarious. I don't know if you've seen it. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long. We'll link to it in the notes, called The Time Traveling Nutritionist. And this couple, in the 60s is sitting down to eat breakfast and zap, a guy appears and he goes, "Wait, don't eat that egg. The egg's bad for you. It's got cholesterol." They're like, "Wow, thanks for letting us know." And then he leaves and zap, he comes back and he goes, "Wait, you can't have the egg yolk. The egg white's probably fine. There's good and bad cholesterol." And he keeps coming back and tries to get rid of the bread. And we don't know anything about cholesterol, but the original story was that cholesterol was what was causing the plaques, correct?
Yeah, right. It was the cholesterol and the saturated fat caused the plaque. And there's, you hear people say, well, I never scooped sugar out of anybody's artery. I've only scooped fat out of people's arteries. But that just completely ignores the whole complicated process that happens in our bodies, and it's just so overly simplistic and makes for a nice soundbite, but it's not how it works. It's not that you eat fat and fat clogs your artery. It's not that you eat cholesterol and cholesterol clogs your artery. And that analogy you give of going back to the 1960s, the best thing that would have happened is you go back to the 1950s, say, and leave it there and keep the government out of it, keep national regulations out of it. Just say, eat the way your grandma ate in the 50s and you're going to be just fine, instead of this failed experiment of what was supposed to be a healthy diet over the past 60 years or so.
So yeah, so interesting. So first, cholesterol's bad, and then we realize there's different kinds. But I think most people don't even know that when we talk about good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, cholesterol is just cholesterol, correct?
Yeah, that's another complete misnomer that LDL is bad cholesterol, HDL is good cholesterol. The cholesterol is all the same. The lipoproteins are the LDL lipoproteins or the HDL lipoproteins. They may carry it in different ways or act in different ways, but cholesterol is cholesterol. So dietary cholesterol is now, according to many of the guidelines, no longer a nutrient of concern, meaning, you don't have to specifically try and limit dietary cholesterol, because eating dietary cholesterol may raise your overall cholesterol a little bit, but it raises your LDL and HDL, usually more HDL percentage wise, and it does not contribute to heart disease. And that's what really matters. Like, nobody dies from cholesterol. People die from heart attacks, and that's what you care about. So if something raises your total cholesterol but does not increase your risk of heart attacks or strokes or any negative health consequence, then why should you care? And so that's part of the issue with dietary cholesterol and its effect on health. Is it's a non-issue, really. Especially things like shellfish that are high in dietary cholesterol are not a problem. Egg yolks high in dietary cholesterol are not a problem. Eggs have been studied probably more than any other food. It seems like every other week there's a new meta-analysis or a new study about eggs. And I think the clear consensus is that eggs are perfectly fine for your health, including the egg yolk.
Interesting. I think I probably stole this from Dave Feldman at some point, or somebody in the space, but a nice way to think of this might be, since cholesterol is kind of a lipid, it doesn't swim, it doesn't mix with water, so it doesn't like the pool. So it needs a way to get around, and that vehicle can be LDL, HDL, all those particles that you mentioned. But there is a difference between how many cars are on the road versus how many passengers are in the cars. Is that right?
Exactly right. So if you think about what causes traffic, it's not how many people are in the cars, it's how many cars are on the road. So the analogy then for your LDL, it's not how much cholesterol you have packed into a single LDL particle, but it can be how many particles are on the road, regardless of how much cholesterol is in them. Now, that analogy is true to a point, but there's so much more to LDL than just number as well. The inflammatory and oxidative components of the LDL, whether they're altered in any way, because LDL is cleared by receptors on your liver, and you want it to get cleared and recycled and have new LDL come. You don't want it to stick around in your system for a long time or get retained in the vessel wall. And LDL particles that are inflamed or oxidized have a much higher likelihood of having that happen to them. So that's where lifestyles that are going to reduce that oxidation and improve your metabolic health and reduce your visceral fat, that's where those lifestyles are going to be very important, even if they don't change the number of the LDL particles, or even if they increase the number of the LDL particles. If they're significantly reducing the oxidative and inflammatory components, then it's likely a net benefit. And the same with what we call the glycation end products, or that having too much glucose around affects your blood vessels. If you can improve that status of your cardiovascular system, then you also are having a net benefit, even if the number of LDL particles goes up a little bit. And this was shown nicely by some of the studies that Virta Health did with low-carb ketogenic diet. The LDL cholesterol in one of those studies went up by, I think it was 7%. But when you calculated their 10-year cardiovascular risk, it went down by 12%. Wow. So their cardiovascular risk improved by 12%, despite their LDL going up by 7%. And I think that's just such a perfect example of how a comprehensive lifestyle intervention that improves metabolic health is going to be a net benefit, even if LDL goes up a little bit.
Interesting. So when somebody goes to the doctor and they get their cholesterol checked, what numbers do they normally get? Are they seeing the difference between the cars on the road or the passengers in the car?
No, that's a good question. The standard lipid profile only shows you the total cholesterol, the amount of HDL cholesterol. the number of triglycerides, and then it calculates an LDL. It doesn't even, most tests don't even measure LDL, they calculate LDL. And again, it's just the total LDL cholesterol, not the number of particles. So you can use your triglycerides and your HDL and use your triglyceride to HDL ratio as a bit of a surrogate marker to say, do you have the small, dense LDLs, which are more likely to happen if you have high triglycerides and low HDL? Or are you more likely to have the larger, less dense and less concerning LDLs, which is more likely to happen when you have higher HDL and lower triglycerides? But that's a surrogate and is not perfect. So if you wanted to actually measure it, then you would need to get what's called advanced lipid testing. Some tests call it, an NMR lipid panel. Some just call it a advanced lipoprotein panel. But it depends on the lab you use. But the point is to measure the LDL particle number, or what's called the ApoB level, and get a much more detailed analysis of the LDL itself. So that is a separate test than what most people get. But the key is, even on your basic test, just make sure you're not looking at just the LDL. Make sure you're looking at the triglycerides and HDL as well, and putting that all into context.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it, a really strategic way to think about it. I mean, I've been trained in the past to do those more basic tests, and you get a little sticker that spits out a number, in 5 minutes, and use that to maybe, you could use the glucose to say, okay, this is a hint, this is a clue, this will tell you something. But the HDL to triglyceride ratio can say, okay, take this to your doctor, go get a more advanced blood test. And then I really want to hammer home, what are some of those other markers you mentioned to see whether there's actually a problem?
Yeah, well, usually you can get a panel that's going to include the LDL particle number and the number of small particles, because you want to make sure your small particles are low, and the overall size of the LDL particle, a lot of the labs will report as well, which is good because you want that overall size to be bigger, better than smaller. And then some of them will also tell you about your VLDLs, which are what's called a remnant, or a very low density lipoprotein, which are also atherogenic, and so you want to have few of those. And they can tell you the number of HDL particles, just like the number of LDL particles. So those are some of the advanced testing that usually come together in one panel. And then lipoprotein little a is another big one. That is a type of LDL that's modified enough so that it's not taken up as well by the LDL receptor, and also is more likely to become oxidized and retained in the vessel wall, and can actually even mimic a natural process in our body to cause blood clots. So it's a concerning type of lipoprotein. So lipoprotein little a is another important test to get done. And then beyond that, inflammatory markers, just a high sensitivity CRP is a very important test for general inflammation. And then I like a test called a LPPLA2, which is a little more specific for lipid inflammation. And then, of course, metabolic parameters. Again, I think we're very short-sighted if we just focus on the lipids. So, fasting blood sugar is one of the worst tests you can do to try and assess your blood sugar status. So at least getting the hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month average of your blood sugar. But even better is checking your blood sugar throughout the day, before you eat, after you eat. Continuous glucose monitors are great ways to do that. Or just sticking your finger multiple times a day to get those results also works. And then insulin levels as well, because a glucose of 90 with an insulin of 30 is much worse than a glucose of 98 with an insulin of 5. Even though the glucose is higher in that second scenario, with a much lower insulin level, that's the much better place to be. So getting an insulin level is also really helpful. So those are the tests I usually recommend beyond the standard lipid profile.
I'm so glad you mentioned a continuous glucose monitor. For the listener, I mean, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but imagine I took a picture of the freeway and sent it over to you and said, this is what traffic is like. And I don't tell you what time it is. Well, it could be 5 p.m. or it could be 5 a.m. or it could be 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. Like you don't exactly know. You can try to control some variables, but you really don't exactly know what's going on. And a continuous glucose monitor will show you like a video of the freeway. So you get to see all the different things that you do in your life and how they affect your blood sugar, and you can adjust accordingly. It almost self-corrects. You're right. They're a pretty cool tool. I'm really glad you brought that one up. It sounds like the story with the LDL cholesterol has a lot of context and gets a little bit complicated, and a basic, cholesterol test doesn't tell you all that information. So is it logical and fair to say that it's never bad if you have very high LDL total, like LDL-C, and not necessarily always good if you have a low LDL-C?
Yeah, we definitely have to get away from the always and the nevers, that's for sure. And the traditional medical teaching is frequently seen that all elevated LDL is equally dangerous and needs to be lowered as low as possible, which I think is incorrect. But the corollary to say LDL does not matter at all is also completely incorrect. LDL clearly has a role in atherogenesis. There's no in developing coronary disease. There's no question about that it has a role. But that role is not the same in all situations, and that's what we need to recognize. There's studies that show the impact of LDL when there is also a high HDL and low triglycerides is dramatically less than the impact of LDL when there is low HDL and high triglycerides. So the context is really, really important. But again, even with high HDL and low triglycerides, it doesn't mean LDL is completely negligible and you can ignore it. It just means it's much less impactful than in other situations. So we definitely have to get away from the always and nevers and instead put things into context, which is a little more complicated, right? It's so much easier if you can just say, this is evil, treat it in everybody. And that's a very simple message that anybody can understand. The only problem is it's wrong. So it doesn't help. And instead you get someone like me saying, well, maybe this, maybe that, but you got to look at this. And what about this? And you got to test this. And in this situation, it's a little different. And the person's fallen asleep before, you can come to a conclusion. So, that's the trick, that is trying to make the message concise enough and understandable enough, but still capture the nuance to make it accurate.
Well, we keep inviting you guys on here and asking the question, like, what's the perfect diet? Just tell us exactly what to eat so we can end this nonsense and just go do it, and everybody will know, and it's fine. It's easy. we keep getting disappointed.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So all right, the story goes, I go to my doctor, I'm having a blood test done. I know about it ahead of time. So maybe I even decide to eat really healthy for a few days. I'm going to do, quote unquote, healthy food and lots of salads and not a lot of fat. And I go, which can impact your LDL. It can make it go up. And I get a high number. And the doctor says, wow, your LDL cholesterol, your bad cholesterol is high. That's really bad. So we're going to give you medication. And generally speaking, I correct me if I'm wrong, they will give somebody a statin, which I believe is still the number one prescribed medication on the planet. Is that correct?
I don't know if that statement's correct or not, but I would not be surprised if it is. I think that and like proton pump inhibitors were up there at some point, and antidepressants were up there at some point. So
gotcha.
Those are probably the top three. But yeah, whether it's number one or not, I think it's clear it's overprescribed and a absolute knee-jerk reaction for most doctors for any elevated LDL. So the first thing I would say is don't do that. Don't change your diet for a blood test. Dave Feldman has shown, he's done amazing work to show how just a couple of days of changing your diet can dramatically affect your blood test. And I think that's phenomenal work. And so glad that he's done that. But at the same time, I don't want anybody to do it, because if you're getting your blood drawn, you want to know what your chronic everyday living does to your blood work. You don't want to know what the past 2 days have done to your blood work, because that doesn't really tell you the answers you're trying to get. If you're trying to change your lab values for a specific reason, okay, then what Dave does is pretty amazing. But the reason why what his work is so important is because it shows a lot of the misconceptions we have about LDL and about cholesterol, and that's why it's so important. But when you get your lab work done, you really want to be in your steady state. You want to be living your life the way you chronically live your life, because that's going to give you the most information. So if then you get a knee-jerk reaction, your LDL is high, here's your statin. I mean, there's so many different nuances, but the first thing is to say, well, wait a second, did you calculate my 10-year risk? Because a lot of times people will react to an LDL of 130, 140, 150 and say it's too high, here's your statin. And you can, use these LDL risk calculators. And if your risk comes out at like, 2, 3, 4, 5%, you're not a candidate for statin. There's no question about, statin is not beneficial in those scenarios. Even our guidelines, which are very pro-statin, would say you don't need a statin there. The second thing, though, is to say, well, what about better measures of vascular disease as opposed to just LDL? What is my metabolic health? If you have type 2 diabetes, then yes, then that's a vote that maybe the statin would be beneficial, because in that setting, the LDL is more concerning. Although the other approach is say, well, why don't we address the type 2 diabetes and the metabolic health more aggressively as well, so that is taken care of, and then that risk is no longer there. A third thing, though, is to say, well, what about a calcium score? Because a calcium score can tell me if I have any atherosclerosis now, if I have any calcification, which is basically a healing response to injury in the blood vessel of the heart. And if that is 0, then there's a good study showing there's no benefit to statins for most people with a calcium score of 0, at least out to 10 years. So you can learn a lot more than just reacting to the LDL. And so if you're hesitant at all, those are some good questions to ask. What's my calculated 10-year risk? What are the measurements of my metabolic health? And what is my calcium score? Because those can all play in. Now, again, they all have to be taken into context based on, you someone whose family members drop dead of heart attacks in their 40s. I'm going to treat that person different than someone who has no family history of heart disease, or use someone who smoked for 20 years. Or use someone, again, who has type 2 diabetes or has high blood pressure, whose LP little a is high. All those things are going to impact how I treat you. And that goes well beyond just a knee-jerk reaction to the LDL.
Yeah, gotcha. We need to be like totally, fair and honest and say that we're definitely not saying there's no place ever for a statin, because there absolutely is. I'm just saying, most people would flip open a Sports Illustrated and see an ad for, some of these drugs and say, wow, this headline says this is going to reduce my risk by 50%, and we need to put this in the drinking water. And that, again,
yeah,
you're doing such a great job explaining there's all the nuance and context and how, careful people need to be to find the right path and make sure they're chasing, the actual problem. So
and that whole reduction by 50% is just the most brilliant marketing by drug companies around. I mean, that's called a relative risk, and it is phenomenal marketing, but it is also phenomenally misleading because if your risk is 1% and you lower it to 0.5%, that's a 50% reduction. It's also a 0.5% reduction. That's called the absolute risk. But that's not sexy. That doesn't sell drugs to say a 0.5% reduction, but the 50% reduction will sell drugs. So, I mean, that's just all marketing, and you really need to put that in the context of what is the absolute risk reduction as well.
Wow. Yeah, that's so important to point out. Okay, so we've, kind of debunked a few things, and we've talked a little bit about lifestyle. What are a few specific things that people can be doing? I know we mentioned, the diet and exercise, but what specific things would you recommend for somebody who is concerned? Maybe they do have poor metabolic health and they don't, they don't want to come see you. They want to have a long and happy life. What things should they be thinking about specifically?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the average person, the average American, or the average person in an industrialized society, we eat too many calories. I mean, that is clear. We eat way too many calories, and too many calories usually coming from carbohydrates or food that combines carbohydrates and fats. And when you look in nature, there actually aren't really any natural foods that are high in both carbohydrates and fats together. And part of the problem is that's what makes up these hyper palatable foods, and that we can just overeat without even thinking about it. They don't hit our satiety mechanisms. In fact, they hit our dopamine receptors instead, that say we want more, we want more, we want more. So number one is getting rid of those. And it sounds so easy to say, but it can be so challenging for people to do. Just like saying reducing calories is so easy to say, but so challenging for people to do. So you have to find a diet that allows you to do that without feeling like you're sacrificing. And for many people, that is a low carbohydrate diet that is relatively high in protein. I mean, 25, 30, 35% of your calories from protein is now considered a high protein diet, which is a little ridiculous because it's actually what our ancestors and most hunter-gatherer societies most likely ate. So it's most likely the appropriate protein diet rather than a high protein diet. So if you could have a protein diet that's around 30% with natural sources of protein, keep your carbs relatively low, and that could be 100 grams for some people, it could be 50 grams for some people, and fill the rest with sort of natural fats to help with taste and enjoyment. That's the way that most people would benefit from eating. And if you can do that in a way where you're eating, spaced out, maybe 2 big meals with one, or 2, moderate meals with one snack, having at least 12 hours between 2 of your meals. If you can get that to 14 or 16 hours, probably a little bit better. But of course, doing that as long as you're not stimulating hunger and craving and binging. So it's finding that sweet spot for the diet that hits all those parameters for you. And then making sure you're physically active. That doesn't mean, doing 30 minutes on a treadmill and then sitting on your rump all day long. But staying active, going for walks, getting outside, having active hobbies, doing some resistance training. Those are some of the biggest pillars that are going to help you improve your health. Then a lot of, diet and exercise get the majority of the attention because that's where a lot of the benefits are going to come from, but making sure you're prioritizing your sleep. We also live in an environment that, people brag about not needing much sleep or not getting much sleep. And we watch, movies and videos on our computer and then turn off the computer and expect to fall right asleep. And instead we're up for 2 hours and we have poor quality sleep. Well, that has a lot to do with it too. So good sleep hygiene, staying away from the screens before sleep, or at least at the minimum using some blue blocking glasses, although I think those can help, but much better is just staying off of tech before sleep, making sure your room is dark and cool and quiet, all those things that sound like lip service, but actually do make a big difference when you commit to it and when you prioritize it. And the same for stress management. We can't make stress go away, but we can change how our bodies react to it. So that is beneficial to prioritize that as well. So actually, that's sort of like my little bit of rambling of what I think the main pillars are for people to address when it comes to improving your health.
No, that's great. That hits all the buckets that I would be talking about too. I mean, I've been stealing this information from you guys for a very long time. And I think it's practical. I think that's something that can really help. It can help people that are on the ground that are confused with, different information. And I love that you make it simple. You make it practical. You've also been sharing this message for a long time. You were podcasting long before you started with Diet Doctor. And I got to hear some of your older podcasts on Low-Carb Cardiologist. And what was the original name of that podcast?
Yeah, it's had a couple of iterations. It started as Boundless Health podcast and then rebranded as Low-Carb Cardiologist podcast. And then shortly after that, I got recruited by Diet Doctor. So then I just shut that down and became the Diet Doctor podcast. So I've had a couple of iterations through my podcasting career, but it's been great. And that's a big part of our message and our goal at Diet Doctor is to try and make this simple because it can be very complicated and very difficult if you don't know where to start and if you don't know how to do it. And that's why we have things like our completely free 2-week keto challenge. So if you want to get started on a keto diet, we're going to show you how to do it. And then we've got a even more in-depth 10-week weight loss for good course to help you with more detailed knowledge and intervention on healthy weight loss. We even have a Let's Get Moving course for people who are not very experienced with exercise and physical activity to help these beginners and even intermediates kind of get started with exercise. And we've got over 1,000 recipes. And now we've got a personalized meal planner where you just answer some questions about, your age, your gender, your physical activity, your medical conditions, your goals. And it creates a meal plan for you with a shopping list, to get you started. So that's really what we're trying to do is find ways to make this easier for people to get started with a journey, a healthy weight loss journey. And I always have to throw that in there, healthy weight loss journey. We don't want you losing weight regardless of how it's lost. We want you losing weight in a healthy way. Improving metabolic health is my number one priority for people, and losing weight would be a secondary priority. But for a lot of people, it's the opposite. People focus more on the weight individually. So I want to make sure that they know that there's a healthy way to do that. And that's what we try to achieve at Diet Doctor.
Well, you don't try to achieve that. You definitely achieve that. You knock it out of the park on that website. Mm-hmm. You guys did such a great job putting together the resources, all of the guides, the great movies. The meal planner is tremendous. Exercise tips. I mean, you can just find everything in one place. You even have this amazing reference section at the end where you're linking everybody else's article. So if somebody wants to deep dive or learn more about somebody else, you're not like competing with them. You're creating with them and sharing that message along. I think you guys did such a good job. How did that relationship start, you with Diet Doctor?
Well, Dr. Andreas Einfeld created Diet Doctor. It's actually an amazing success story. I mean, it started with a blog in Swedish only. It wasn't even English because he's in Sweden. So it started with a blog in Swedish, and then he wrote a book that was really popular. And then he started to write some English content and created the website, and it just took off. He did such an amazing job with that. My relationship with Diet Doctor started through podcasting, that they wanted to start a podcast. And I guess they were fans of my podcast, which I was very flattered and thankful. And they said, "Hey, do you want to come run our podcast?" And I said, "Sure." So I started running their podcast. And then after about a year of that, they recruited me to come on as their medical director. And it was just such a great fit. I mean, the company that's the right company for you. The people that are the right people to work with. And there was no question that Diet Doctor was that. I mean, the mission, I agree with 100%. The people are so motivated and so amazing. And the goal to help as many people and to make it simple for as many people and to focus on metabolic health. I mean, it was just so in line with my message and my goals. And Andreas and Bjarte, the COO, and our whole team of, our writers and our editors, and just such an amazing team to work with, that it was an easy decision for me to come on board. And it's been, I haven't looked back. It's been almost 2 years, and it's been great.
Wow. Well, I'm sure it was an easy decision for them, not only to make you the medical director, but also initially as the podcast host, because you are a great host. You do a really, really good job with your interviews. You're really good at staying out of the way and letting the person answer the questions. You guide the conversation really well. You have a real talent for that, I have to tell you. It's really great.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And, one of the funny things about podcasting is I can't even count how many times it's happened. I'd finish a podcast and I'd come out of my little office and my wife would ask me how to go. And I'd be like, you know what? I'm not sure if anybody's going to listen to it, but I don't care. I just had the greatest conversation with this person. And you get the right guests and you just have an amazing conversation. And it's been an opportunity for me to meet people and talk to people that I probably wouldn't have otherwise had. And so it's been so enjoyable. And that's the part that I really love the most about it. And hopefully other people find it helpful too. But I just love the conversations and learning so much.
Yeah, totally. I agree. The thing that just surprised me the most is not only how much I love having these conversations and how many of all of you, like, to me, are like rock stars, like all these big names. You're not somebody that talks to me. You're somebody I listen to. Like, it's so cool to have that conversation, but then also to listen to it again afterwards. As much as I hate my own voice and hate to hear my own voice, I always learn something. And I'm having this conversation with you right now. I'll listen to this again when we release the episode and be like, boy, that's a really good point. I missed that when we were doing the interview. It's so great.
Yeah, that's a fun part about it for sure.
That's awesome. So what is your work like with Diet Doctor as a medical director? Like, what is kind of like practical things that you do day to day?
Well, number one is just making sure anything that goes up on our website is medically accurate and scientifically accurate. So all of our guides go through an evidence-based process. I'm in charge of that process. Then any guide that has previously been written gets an annual update on evidence basing. So it's really trying to stay as current and up to date on what the literature says about healthy weight loss, nutrition, metabolic health, low carb diets, all of that combined, and trying to make sure we're wording things appropriately. I don't want to overstate what the evidence says. So one of my big mantras is that the strength of the recommendation has to be backed by the strength of the evidence. We can't take a very poor quality, weak nutritional epidemiology study and say, look, see, this proves that this is the case. And, that happens left and right all over the place. But you have to say, this, epidemiology study reported this. Now, let's put that in the context of what are the problems with the epidemiology, what are the, put in the context of what other evidence says, and for positive and for negative, right? Like there are epidemiology studies that say eating more red meat reduces the incidence of stroke. Those studies exist. But I can't sit here and say, see, it proves red meat is healthy and reduces the incidence of stroke. No, that's not the case. That's not how the science works. But at the same time, you can't say, well, those people who eat red meat are more likely to get heart attacks, therefore it proves that that's the case. No, absolutely not. It does nothing of the sort. It proves that it may strongly suggest that people who ignore the message in the 1990s and early 2000s that red meat is dangerous for your health, and people who ignore that and eat more red meat are likely to do other unhealthy things. So anyway, I'm kind of going into probably more detail than you wanted on this question, but the point being that one of my main jobs is to make sure we are accurately representing what studies show, what the literature shows, and what it represents, and making sure that's reflected throughout our website. So that's my main job. And then, of course, creating content and writing new guides and helping, frame what our products are moving forward, how we can reach more people, whether that's clinicians or individuals, and help them achieve healthy weight loss, what that means and what we need to put in place to have that happen. So that's another part of the job that I'm really excited about. So anything I'm doing with Diet Doctor right now, I just love doing, because I can see how many people we're helping and how much we're helping them.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, they're so helpful. For the listener, we've talked about this before, but when we're talking about epidemiology, if you woke up this morning and the sun also rose, I wouldn't go out and start thinking that you're making the sun rise every morning. I'm sorry to bust your bubble, but that's kind of what epidemiology is. And you mentioned Ornish, which I think is another great example of that. Like that was a pretty comprehensive plan originally, wasn't it? Like they would change people's exercise and they would get them meditating and stop smoking and all of these different factors plus nutrition. And then they used, positive improvements to say it was the nutrition that did it, when that's not true. You can't parse that out with that type of a study. Is that right?
Absolutely. That is spot on. Yeah. If you have a comprehensive lifestyle intervention program, then your study can show the results of a comprehensive lifestyle intervention program. It cannot say, oh, well, it must have been the diet that did it, or it must have been the stress management that did it, or it must have been the exercise that did it, or it must have been the community involvement that did it, or it must have been the extra attention that you got from your physician to make sure your blood pressure was okay and your blood sugar was okay, right? You can't parse out one specific element of that. And like that study had plenty of other problems beyond just that. So for people to use Dr. Ornish's study to say this proves that low-fat diets reverse heart disease is incredibly misleading, unfortunately.
Impossible. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Diet Doctor kind of evolving over time and getting ready for the future. That also needs to kind of blend with the science and how the science is evolving and changing. So how do you see those two things changing? Like what kinds of evolutions are you seeing with, the science, maybe how do you integrate that into like your meal plans or the recommendations that you make on that site?
Yeah, one interesting thing is really looking at when you look at randomized controlled trials for low carb diets that show better weight loss and better metabolic improvements and blood sugar improvements compared to low fat diets. Not only do most of those studies lower the carbohydrates, but a lot of them, or the majority of them, also increase the protein. And so that's another area of focus, is that really as a population, we don't get enough protein and would likely benefit by raising protein. And, a keto diet or a low carb diet is frequently called low carb high fat, which ignores the protein in the name. So one of the ways we're evolving is saying, look, carbs are certainly important. There's no question about that, but so is protein. And maybe we've been undervaluing protein. And maybe the best combination is a higher protein, lower carb diet. And again, going back to my prior comments, this concept that 30% of your calories from protein is a high protein diet is a little bit ridiculous when put into evolutionary perspective. So part of it is is us evolving in that way, as we see the science behind it, and just keeping tabs on, look, doing this in a way that works practically is so important. Addressing hunger is so important. Addressing cravings is so important. You can try and prescribe low calorie diets, which can definitely work for weight loss. There's no question about it. It can definitely work for improving blood sugar. But if it's not done in a way that's going to be practical and is going to work for people, then it's not going to work. So that's the other part of how we're evolving, is constantly getting feedback from not just the literature, but also our members and our listeners and viewers, and saying, well, what can we improve to make this work better for you? So we're constantly trying to improve, both from a science standpoint and from a practical implication standpoint as well.
Yeah, I love that. And you guys do such a good job of that. It's so great. It's also interesting. We've had a few people who follow the carnivore diet on our show, and I've, decided to try that for a month in let's see, what was it, April of 2019. And I just enjoyed it so much. It's basically what I still do, maybe not as strict, but that's also been an interesting cohort of people that are saying they're just eating meat and they feel great. So that is moving the ball in the right direction as far as the protein intake. And, that's a diet that I would have laughed you out of the room if you'd have told me about 5 years ago. Like,
yeah, same here. Yeah, same here. I mean, exactly 5 years ago, I didn't know carnivore diets existed, and I would have thought you're crazy if you tried one. Now I absolutely see that they have a role, and especially when you talk about practical and doable. I mean, what's easier than that? We throw a couple steaks on the grill and that's it. I mean, from a practical standpoint, it's certainly easy. From an elimination diet standpoint, it works wonders. I'm a big fan of using them, at least in the short term, for people who need some version of an elimination diet. So they definitely have their role. I'd agree with that.
So what are you working on for the future?
Yeah, I mean, the future is just developing the next great products that we can create at Diet Doctor, and the next great guides and information to help people on their healthy weight loss journey. A lot of it's going to focus on protein and low carb, and how to accurately measure and improve upon healthy weight loss progress. So I'm really excited about that. And then I still see clients individually through Low-Carb-Cardiologist.com. I can see clients in, I think it's 7 states now, to do consultations to help them, because so many people see their doctor and like we've talked about, get the knee-jerk reaction for statins and don't get the full assessment. And I really like to be able to help those people as much as I can to see things from the broader perspective. And then helping get the word out, like through Diet Doctor, reaching as many clinicians as possible. We've got this Diet Doctor Pro membership, or Diet Doctor Professional membership. We could just kind of abbreviate it as DD Pro, that we're developing now, which is a membership for professionals, whether it's physicians or chiropractors or nurse practitioners or nutritionists or health coaches or personal trainers, so that they can have a membership and sign their clients up at a discounted rate. And then we're starting to build out some of the platform for that, where you can track your clients and see how they're doing and make recommendations. That's what I'm really excited about. That'll be coming down the road, hopefully later this year, to have some of that functionality. But I'm really excited about that, to reach more clinicians so that they can help their individual clients succeed.
Wow, that's awesome. I can't wait for that one. That will definitely be something I will be into when it comes out. That's great.
Excellent.
Man, Dr. Scher, this has been such a great conversation, and I've learned so much. What you've already given us a lot of really great tips. If you had to choose one for most people, what is one simple tip that the average person could take away from this conversation and apply in their lives to see some benefit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so hard to boil down to just one, but I guess the number one thing is realize that your health is your top priority. And I think a number of people address their health sort of when they have time or when they get to it, or they don't even think about it. But addressing your health as your number one priority is so important. And there's an old saying, as a doctor, if you want health more than your patient wants it, your patient wants it, then they're not going to get it. It's not going to work. So for you to be your own best advocate, for you to be the most concerned person about your own health, and to prioritize it is key, because that's when you start to learn so much. That's when you start to be your best advocate and engage in ways that help your health far more than the medical system can. If you leave it up to the medical system, you're in big trouble.
Wow.
If you prioritize it yourself, that's where you're going to get the best results.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. I really love that. And if you have any question as to whether that's good advice or not, I would say to go back to 2020 and see what happened. I mean, I remember making a post when all of this was going down, the coronavirus outbreak, pandemic, and saying like, look, we told you to eat healthy. We told you to exercise and be resilient and get your vitamin D and deal with stress. And like, so you can get on the other end of stressful times. Like, this is why you do it, and start now. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but take a step in the right direction. I love that you said that. I think that's a really great practical tip for people. You mentioned a lot of different landing places where people can go to find you. Where would you like people to go primarily to find you and your work?
Yeah, I mean, the best is dietdoctor.com. You'll find our website there. We also have a YouTube channel where I do a number of videos, and our podcast is on video as well on YouTube. So either Diet Doctor on YouTube or dietdoctor.com. That's where we're going to have the majority of the information. And then lowcarbcardiologist.com for those who want to maybe see if it's right to see me as a patient.
That's great. We'll link to all of that in the show notes. Dr. Bret Scher, thank you so much for all of your work, for all of your content. Thank you so much for your podcasting and the information that you're bringing to people. It is very well done, and it is simple. You are accomplishing the goal you were setting out to do. It's helping a lot of people. I can tell you that personally, and really thank you for everything you've done, and thank you for your time here today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Casey. Thank you so much for all your kind words, for this opportunity, and for all the great work you're doing. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.